Okay, so I was asked the question on in doing spiritual work around one aspect would be sleep and suffocation at sleep, and finding that there was a belief around gratitude, and also later it came that if one wasn't grateful, there was a belief that the opposite might happen. It might not help. And I could sort of relate to that. I think how I relate to that is how I'd see it. It's levels of consciousness, actually, and getting more and more clear on the ego belief systems as one does spiritual work. For me, it would be like in the early days, I was totally ungrateful. I didn't want to surrender to God. And so just the fear of realizing I had to be humble and try and be grateful was actually progress. I was actually going up, even though there was still more to be revealed. So I'd say that even though there's fear and there's belief systems, it's still a higher level of consciousness than being defiantly ungrateful. So some level of humility and a raise in consciousness is actually occurring. And as the consciousness level raises, then the beliefs becomes even more clear that there is some fear-related beliefs and limitations in those beliefs. And those become highlighted so that even those fearful limiting beliefs can be released at a higher altitude. So I think in the beginning it's like ungrateful and contempt for God. Then later, as one starts to clear that, one starts to have fear because one is savaged by the ego. So one tries to be grateful out of fear. But that for me is actually an improvement than being, contemptuous towards divinity. You work a Course in Miracles or a 12-step program out of fear, but that's better than not working it at all. Even though there might be fear and guilt and worry about not working it, it's still an improved level of consciousness. And then as one does the spiritual work, one realizes that one is doing the Course in Miracles or 12 steps or whatever spiritual practice out of, there's some fear stuff and there's some guilt stuff and all kinds of stuff. And then one can let go of that. So then the gratitude becomes natural, and the practice becomes unfear related, but becomes devotional as opposed to. But for me, that does make sense. And I think most people do go through that. They do the spiritual work grudgingly and with fear, and then later find out there's more to release on that. But for me, it would be progress than not doing the work. And it would actually be a higher level of consciousness to do spiritual work from fear than to be in contempt and not do any spiritual work. So it's actually an improvement. And then as you improve in consciousness, then you sort of see fears and limitations which you can release. So I can relate to that. And there is some aspect, I think later on it's caution of not wandering back into the ego. One gets a natural caution of vigilance, which is not fear. But in the beginning of a spiritual speaker's journey, there is a lot of fear because if one lets go of the spiritual practice and lets go of the vigilance, one then wanders off into the ego and then gets bitten by the ego. So there's a natural fear. But as one releases that fear, there's a natural, what I'd call, it becomes self-sustaining, the practice, and there's less temptation to wander off into the ego. And the fear is replaced by vigilance. I mean, the world is full of temptation to get hooked back into stories, belief systems, and ego indulgences. So naturally, I think, most spiritual traditions teach some level of vigilance, and until enlightenment, you don't have to be vigilant. I mean, the ego's dead, so there is nothing to be vigilant and there's nothing to fear, and the ego can't regenerate. But that's if you're enlightened, then there's no ego to return to. Otherwise, if the ego is still subtly there, it can play all kinds of tricks. So, yep, I think it's a middle stage. In the beginning, one doesn't do the spiritual work, and then one has fear of not doing the spiritual. But that's an improvement. Like if I don't do my practice, then I'm going to have a bad night's sleep. But that's better than not doing the practice at all and being in a position of contempt and just wallowing in addictions and ego fantasies. So it's actually improvement. And I do think grace does actually respond to an improvement, even if it's not perfect. There is some fear and there is but it's still a higher level of humility to be doing it with some level of fear, even though there are some belief systems, even though those become, higher altitude of consciousness and become clearer, so one can release any limited fear beliefs that are going on out of fear or unworthiness, or or there can be stuff from certain spiritual traditions, like you have to beat yourself up, or if you're not fearful enough, then you won't earn the spiritual right, which is not helpful, the kind of the punishing God kind of thing. Um, so, yep, so I'll stop with that.